Perhaps this is why the house endures, because it reminds us that behind every lavish façade, there are human stories of pain, perseverance, and purpose. And maybe the dark story is not dark at all, but a testament to the light that people can create when confronted with hatred and loss. It looks like a fairy tale castle rising above the fields of Buckinghamshire, a French-style chateau perched on an English hill with pinnacles, turrets, and sweeping terraces. From a distance, you might mistake Waddesdon Manor for a slice of the Loire Valley transplanted to rural Britain, a trophy of old money and ancient nobility. The driveway climbs through parkland to reveal a façade borrowed from the Château of the Valois. Elegant staircases, carved stone and conical towers. It is a place of theatrical entrances and glamorous dinners, where royalty and statesmen once came to be entertained. Yet the story of how this house came to exist and what it has witnessed is far darker and more complicated than the romantic silhouette suggests. When you look closely, you see a mansion built out of grief, ambition, exclusion, and survival. You see a family whose wealth turned them into caricatures in the eyes of anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists. A family who were later robbed and driven from their homes by Nazi forces, who responded not with secret world-dominating plots, but with philanthropy and acts of refuge. This is the dark story behind Waddesdon Manor's old money façade. It is a story that raises uncomfortable questions about belonging, prejudice, and how we judge those with wealth and power. To understand Waddesdon, we need to understand the family who built it. The Rothschilds rose from modest beginnings in the Frankfurt ghetto to create one of the most successful banking dynasties in Europe. By the middle of the 19th century, branches of the family were established in England, France, Austria, and Italy. They used their network and their capital to finance governments and infrastructure, to underwrite railway lines and war loans. In doing so, they attracted both admiration and envy. Historian Niall Ferguson notes that by the mid-19th century, they had evolved from traders into fund managers, carefully managing their vast portfolios and preferring stability over conflict. Yet their success also sparked rumors. Conspiracy theorists claimed the family manipulated wars, controlled currencies, and secretly pulled the strings of governments. Most of these stories were rooted not in evidence, but in anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish control of finance. Those slanders would shadow them for generations, making every major Rothschild house a target for gossip. Waddesdon would be no different. Ferdinand de Rothschild, the man who built Waddesdon, was born in 1839 in Paris. He belonged to the Austrian branch of the family and inherited both wealth and expectations. In 1865, he became a British citizen and married his cousin Evelina. The match seemed happy. They shared a love of art and an appreciation of English country life. The happiness did not last. On December 4th, 1866, Evelina went into labor at their London house. She delivered a son, but the child was stillborn, and Evelina herself died later the same day. A short entry in a personal memoir notes the event with heartbreaking simplicity. Evelina gave birth to a son, and one can only imagine Ferdinand's happiness and despair when mother and child died the same day. Ferdinand was devastated. He never remarried, and years later, when describing his life, He wrote that despite the gilded and marble rooms in which he lived, he was lonely and occasionally very miserable. The death of his wife and child colored everything that followed. It also fed the rumor mill. Outsiders who wanted to believe the Rothschilds were cursed or sinister pointed to the tragedy as evidence, missing the simple truth that wealth cannot shield anyone from grief. In his mourning, Ferdinand withdrew from the family bank and devoted himself to collecting art and antiquities. He also sought a country estate where he could escape London and entertain friends. In 1874, he purchased the Waddesdon and Winchendon estates in Buckinghamshire from the Duke of Marlborough. They were 2,700 acres of mainly arable farmland, with no park and no house. There were no convenient railway connections and no scenic gardens, just a windswept, misshapen hill called Lodge Hill, crowned by a farmhouse and carved by a quarry. Why would a man of such means choose a barren hill? He later admitted that he had been looking for a residential estate for some time, and this was all that was available. But he was buoyed by the illusion that a railway line would soon connect the area to London. This decision speaks to Ferdinand's impatience, and perhaps to his desire to transform something unpromising into a showpiece. In this, Waddesdon's story resembles that of many self-made or newly wealthy families. The desire to build a fortress of belonging where there was none. He hired the French architect Hippolyte Alexandre Destailleur, known for his work on the chateau of the French aristocracy. Ferdinand wanted his English retreat to look like the great French houses he had admired. He reasoned that a French architect would be more familiar with the style and details he desired. An English architect, he worried, might not capture the spirit of the Valois chateau. Destailleur agreed, and a French landscape gardener, Lenné, was brought in to design terraces, roads, and plantations. The aim was to conjure the atmosphere of the Loire Valley in the Vale of Aylesbury. Some contemporaries saw this as pretentious, a foreign import on British soil. To Ferdinand, it was about taste and memory. He was building a home that reflected both his continental roots and his aspiration to be accepted among the English upper class. The design borrowed towers from Maintenon and Blois and staircases from Chambord. The result would be an eclectic homage rather than a copy. But the ambition was clear: to build a fairy tale castle with enough grandeur to awe his guests and enough refinement to satisfy his own sense of beauty. The practical realities of building the house were anything but glamorous. Lodge Hill was steep and irregular. When Ferdinand acquired it, most of its timber had been cut, and only a few holly bushes remained. To create the platform for the house, hundreds of laborers and navvies spent years cutting into the hill, leveling slopes and laying roads. A deep gash left by a limestone quarry became a basin and fountain. The local water supply was insufficient, so Ferdinand negotiated with a company in Aylesbury to lay 7 miles of pipes and build a large storage tank. When that proved inadequate during a drought, he had to build an even larger tank. The foundations were unstable because the top of the hill was sand. After months of work, the foundations collapsed and 30 feet of sand had to be excavated until a firm layer of clay was reached. Landslips and drainage issues plagued the site, and roads had to be repeatedly dug and rebuilt. This continuous cycle of collapse and reconstruction left Ferdinand exhausted. He later wrote that during the first 4 years of the project, he rarely visited the site because he was so disheartened by the delays. It is easy to picture the glamorous host at the head of a lavish dinner table. Harder to imagine him trudging through mud, negotiating with engineers, and worrying about water pipes. These details are part of the dark side of building, the physical toil and frustration hidden behind the finished façade. Inside the house, Destailleur's priorities and Ferdinand's needs sometimes clashed. The architect was a purist who valued exterior symmetry over interior convenience. He had little conception of the needs of a large household. Ferdinand had to argue for bigger closets and more practical servant spaces. He eventually added wings to provide the rooms Destailleur had omitted. But these additions made the plan less compact and less efficient. Even a man of immense wealth could not simply wish a house into existence. He had to negotiate with craftsmen, adapt to the whims of his architect, and cope with mistakes. Perhaps this tension between vision and practicality is part of why the house feels so theatrical. It was a stage set built by someone who valued appearance over convenience. Yet the servants and staff who kept the house running had to adapt to corridors and corners designed for spectacle rather than service. Their stories of countless hours polishing silver, carrying food along hidden corridors, sleeping in tiny rooms, rarely make it into guidebooks. Beyond the challenges of construction, Waddesdon's creation also involved a kind of landscape illusion. Ferdinand did not want to wait for decades while newly planted trees grew, so he had fully grown trees transplanted from elsewhere. This was an enormous undertaking. It required teams of men and horses, careful timing, and enormous expense. The result was an instant maturity, an impression that the house had stood among established parkland for centuries. Visitors like Queen Victoria were impressed. When she visited in 1890, she was fascinated by the electric lights disguised as candles and by the luxurious furnishings. After all, electricity was still a novelty, and Waddesdon boasted central heating, running water, and an elevator. It was a modern palace disguised as an old one. The combination of old-world style and cutting-edge technology appealed to high society. The Rothschilds were seen as tastemakers, collecting French art and Sèvres porcelain, and hosting dinners where hedges of roses down the dining table encouraged guests to speak to their neighbors. The art included Dutch masters and Renaissance metalwork, and Ferdinand's new smoking room contained a glittering collection of jewelry, enamel, and carvings. When he died in 1898, he bequeathed that collection, nearly 300 objects, to the British Museum. His will stipulated that the objects should be displayed in a special room to be called the Waddesdon Bequest Room and kept separate from other collections. The museum still honors that request. It was an act of philanthropy that added to his reputation as a collector and benefactor. Waddesdon was not just an art gallery, it was a stage for society. From the house's opening party in May 1880 to the turn of the century, Ferdinand hosted weekend gatherings where up to 20 guests enjoyed hunting, lavish dinners, and conversation. Edward, Prince of Wales, later Edward VII, was a regular. Politicians, writers, and artists came to enjoy the hospitality and to connect with power brokers. Queen Victoria's visit in 1890 was unusual in that she requested it herself. Her interest signals how far the Rothschilds had come. The monarch herself wished to see the home of a Jewish banker whose ancestors had lived in a ghetto. Ferdinand, who had once feared social exclusion, now found himself at the center of the British elite. At the same time, he never fully escaped the feeling of being an outsider. As one visitor wrote, the Rothschilds had to fit into a largely anti-Semitic English culture. They did so by embracing country pursuits, by building magnificent houses, and by adopting the rituals of the aristocracy. Waddesdon was part of this performance. It was a place where wealth could be translated into social capital and where the boundaries of prejudice could be negotiated. After Ferdinand's death on his 59th birthday in 1898, Waddesdon passed to his unmarried sister, Alice. Alice was formidable. She preserved the house and its collections with meticulous care, and even reprimanded Queen Victoria for stepping on one of her flowers. Upon Alice's death in 1922, the house went to her French great-nephew James, Jimmy, de Rothschild. Jimmy and his wife Dorothy further enriched the collections with French decorative arts and held political gatherings, including a Liberal Party rally where David Lloyd George spoke. They also brought in new horticultural schemes. Jimmy was a horse breeder and liberal politician. Dorothy was deeply involved in Zionist causes and philanthropy. In 1929, Jimmy was elected as the Liberal MP for the Isle of Ely, and Waddesdon became a place where political ideas and social issues were discussed over dinner. Yet this world of garden parties and gallery tours would soon be disrupted by the rise of fascism in Europe. The 1930s were a time of growing insecurity for Jewish families. In Austria, palaces belonging to the Rothschilds were confiscated by the Nazis in 1938. The palaces were stripped of their art, furniture, and books, and what remained of the buildings was later sold or destroyed. The heirs received little compensation, and complicated laws made it almost impossible for Austrian Jewish victims to appeal. Much of the former Austrian collection was taken to the Kunsthistorisches Museum or the Austrian Gallery in the Belvedere Palace. Only in the late 1990s, after international pressure, did the Austrian government agree to return or pay for roughly 250 of these art treasures. In Vienna, Baron Louis de Rothschild was arrested and held for ransom. He was only released after paying a huge sum and emigrating. In France, the Vichy regime collaborated with the Nazis to seize Rothschild properties and art. The family's success had made them targets. Anti-Semitic propaganda singled them out, not because of any secret power, but because they symbolized Jewish achievement. These tragedies were not the result of some dark machination on the family's part. They were the product of hatred and envy. Across the Channel, Waddesdon Manor faced its own wartime transformation. As war loomed in 1938 and 1939, the National Gallery considered evacuating its paintings to country houses to protect them from bombing. Waddesdon Manor and other stately homes were surveyed as potential storage sites. Eventually, concerns about accessibility and climate led curators to send most works to quarries in Wales, but the survey itself underscores the trust placed in Waddesdon's solidity. When war was declared, James and Dorothy de Rothschild packed away Waddesdon's art treasures and moved into the bachelor's wing. They opened the main rooms to evacuees from London. More than 100 children were housed in the mansion during the early years of the war. It was the first and only time children lived in those state bedrooms and grand corridors. The transformation from aristocratic playground to nursery was dramatic. Footmen who once served silver dishes now carried trays of school dinners. Portraits of kings and queens looked down on makeshift classrooms. The laughter of children replaced the clinking of crystal. The house also became a refuge for Jewish children fleeing Nazi Germany. In March 1939, 21 Jewish boys from Frankfurt arrived in Waddesdon village through the Kindertransport, accompanied by their head teacher and his family. 9 more boys joined them later. They were housed at the Cedars, a property on the estate, and became known locally as the Cedar Boys. Dorothy de Rothschild took a keen interest in their welfare. She followed their lives as they grew up and even helped some with academic scholarships. In 1983, 15 of those boys returned to Waddesdon for a reunion with Dorothy, by then an elderly widow, to thank her for her support. This episode highlights a different kind of darkness, the horrors that drove these children to leave their homes and the kindness of those who sheltered them. Waddesdon, often caricatured as a symbol of unearned wealth, became a place of safety. The old money mansion opened its doors to the most vulnerable, not because of profit, but because of conscience. The war left other marks on Waddesdon. Windows were taped or boarded up to protect against bomb blasts. The lights were dimmed. The ornate gardens were partly plowed for vegetables as part of the wartime Dig for Victory campaign. Servants left to join the armed forces. The opulence that had once been on display was hidden away in crates and cupboards. After the war, James and Dorothy faced the question of what to do with a house built for a way of life that no longer existed. Many of the Rothschild estates in Buckinghamshire had been sold or lost because of death duties and the economic upheaval of war. Waddesdon, however, remained intact. In 1957, Jimmy bequeathed the house, its contents, and 165 acres of grounds to the National Trust, ensuring that it would be preserved for the nation. The Rothschild Foundation, now chaired by Jacob Rothschild, continues to manage the property and fund its conservation. It was a remarkable gift, a private home turned into a public treasure. Visitors now wander through rooms once reserved for royals and bankers. They marvel at the Flemish tapestries and French furniture, and perhaps imagine secret meetings taking place in the smoking room. But the reality of Waddesdon's past is both more mundane and more poignant. There is another darkness, one that lies not in secret plots, but in the prejudice that surrounded the family. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the Rothschilds were subject to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Writers and cartoonists depicted them as puppet masters, controlling monarchs and financiers. Pamphlets claimed that they manipulated wars for profit, that they controlled all the money in the world. These stories persisted despite evidence to the contrary. As historian Niall Ferguson notes, by the middle of the 19th century, the Rothschilds actually had more to lose from war than they had to gain. They preferred peace because their vast portfolio of government bonds was vulnerable to default or devaluation in wartime. Nonetheless, The myths persisted. Modern conspiracy theorists recycle them on social media, often with a thinly veiled anti-Semitic agenda. For the Rothschilds, houses like Waddesdon became symbols onto which outsiders projected fantasies. The dark story behind the house is not that secret meetings of world leaders took place there. It is that some people would rather believe in hidden cabals than acknowledge the hard work, risk, and philanthropy that built it. Waddesdon's story also touches on the tension between old money and new money. When Ferdinand built his chateau, some British aristocrats sniffed that it was vulgar. They saw it as a display of wealth rather than lineage. The truth is more subtle. The Rothschild wealth was indeed relatively recent compared to that of dukes and earls whose estates dated back centuries. But by the time Waddesdon was constructed, the family had been established in Britain for more than half a century and had provided loans to the British government and funded railways and mines. The building of Waddesdon could be seen as an attempt to create physical roots in the landscape, to transform financial capital into cultural capital. There is a kind of insecurity evident in the design choices, importing French architecture, transplanting mature trees, filling rooms with centuries-old art, all to give an impression of permanence. The irony is that many of those old families lost their estates after the First World War, whereas the Rothschilds' careful philanthropy ensured Waddesdon's survival. It raises questions about what we mean by old money. Is it the age of a fortune or the values with which it is used? Ferdinand's fortune funded a children's hospital in memory of his wife, and his bequest to the British Museum enriched public collections. James and Dorothy's fortune sheltered evacuees and refugees. Perhaps the label "old money" should not blind us to the human intentions behind its use. The story of Waddesdon also reminds us how wealth can be both a shield and a vulnerability. Ferdinand's money allowed him to create a sanctuary, but he could not escape personal tragedy. The Austrian Rothschilds had palaces and art collections, but they were still stripped of their property and forced to flee. James and Dorothy could afford to open their mansion to children, but they could not stop the war or the hatred that drove those children to England. In each case, wealth allowed acts of generosity and resilience, but it did not guarantee immunity from historical forces. This is part of the darkness behind Waddesdon, a recognition that money can build walls, but it cannot hold back grief, envy, or bigotry. Walking through Waddesdon today, you pass through rooms where Ferdinand once smoked cigars with politicians and where evacuees once did their homework. You see gilded tables and Gobelins tapestries, but you also see the portrait of Ferdinand's beloved Evelina, a reminder of the loss that spurred this entire project. You look out over terraces that were carved from a hill at great cost, and over gardens where refugees once played hide-and-seek. There is no sign of secret vaults or world-dominating plots. What you see instead is the collision of hope and fear, of ambition and vulnerability. You see how a family responded to prejudice with culture, to tragedy with creation, to war with refuge. You see how the myths about them say more about the anxieties of the societies around them than they do about the family itself. And you might ask yourself, when you hear people talk about old money or whisper about hidden agendas, are you looking at the surface of a chateau or at the complicated human stories within. There is another layer to Waddesdon's history that is rarely explored: the hidden world of servants who kept the fantasy alive. Behind the carved stone facade and the glittering dining rooms lay a maze of corridors and staircases designed to keep staff invisible. The bachelor's wing contained 10 bedrooms for male guests and 15 bedrooms for permanent staff and visiting servants. It also housed smoking rooms and billiards rooms where men retreated after dinner to discuss politics and business. Below stairs, maids and footmen scrubbed floors, polished brass, and carried endless trays of food along narrow passages. They rose before dawn to light fires and worked long after guests had retired to their luxuriously appointed rooms. Their wages were modest, their living quarters cramped, and yet their labor allowed Ferdinand's fantasy of effortless grandeur to be maintained. How many steps did a housemaid take in a day as she navigated the twisting back stairs? How many times did a footman stand silently in a doorway, unseen, while aristocrats debated the fate of empires? The manners of old money always relied on invisible hands. Waddesdon was no different. A dark story lies in this invisibility. For when we admire the chandeliers and tapestries, we often forget those whose sweat polished them. The tastes of Waddesdon's owners also reveal tensions between performance and personality. Alice de Rothschild, who inherited the estate after Ferdinand's death, was known for her formidable presence. She collected arms and armor and displayed them in the smoking and billiards rooms, creating a masculine environment that contrasted with the delicacy of the drawing rooms. She enforced strict rules about dress and behavior, even scolding Queen Victoria for stepping on one of her prized flowers. Her preference for weaponry was not simply a decorative choice. It spoke to a desire for resilience and self-protection in a world that still viewed her family as outsiders. The presence of swords and shields in a banker's house raises questions. Did she see them as talismans against the prejudices that had hounded her family? Or were they a nod to the idea that respect must sometimes be fought for as well as purchased? The arms glinted in candlelight as guests smoked and told stories, a reminder that even in leisure, there lurked the possibility of conflict. These objects complicate our image of the Rothschilds as purely refined collectors. They reveal a family aware of the need to defend their place in society. Other rooms at Waddesdon carried their own layers of meaning. The red drawing room was hung with portraits by Gainsborough and Reynolds. A lavish organ clock that played tunes on the hour stood near a table set with Sèvres porcelain and ornate candlesticks. Here, ladies in silk gowns sipped tea and exchanged gossip, while footmen circulated with trays. Every detail was designed to convey harmony and culture, from the symmetrical arrangement of pictures to the soft pink of the upholstery. But what did those visitors see when they studied the paintings? Did they notice the subtle emphasis on lineage and respectability, the way the portraits linked the Rothschilds to the British art canon? Did the chimes of the organ clock remind them that time marches on even in a room designed to suggest timelessness? In the state dining room, hedges of roses down the center of the table encouraged intimate conversation. But the unspoken rules of class and religion still shaped who sat where. For a family always conscious of being outsiders, such rooms were not just spaces for entertainment. They were stages on which to perform belonging. The aesthetic choices were strategic, a way to weave the Rothschild narrative into the larger tapestry of English aristocratic life. Reflecting on these layers, servants, collections, personal tastes, forces us to reconsider what we mean when we call Waddesdon an old money mansion. The phrase evokes inherited wealth and effortless grace. Yet the house was built by someone who felt acutely the fragility of his place in society. Its rooms were curated to signal stability and taste, but its foundations literally shifted and collapsed during construction. Its owners displayed medieval armor alongside French porcelain, combining symbols of defense and refinement. They cultivated gardens reminiscent of Versailles, while simultaneously plowing vegetable beds for war. They presided over dinners where prime ministers discussed policy, but they also opened their home to children fleeing bombs. In that tension lies the darkness, the awareness that appearances can never fully erase the precariousness of identity or the inevitability of change. Waddesdon's story is therefore not a tidy fairy tale, but a complex human drama. It asks us to look beyond gossip and myth, beyond the quick labels of old money or new money, and to grapple with the messy, sometimes contradictory realities that shape even the grandest of houses. In the end, the dark story behind Waddesdon Manor is not one of sinister machinations, but one of human frailty set against the backdrop of wealth and power. Ferdinand de Rothschild built his dream house out of sorrow and a desire to belong. He turned a barren hill into a palace because he wanted to create a world in which he could entertain friends and forget, for a moment, his loneliness. The family who inherited it used it to show that Jews could be as English as any squire, and to combat the prejudice that had followed them for generations. When war came, they used their home not to hoard treasures, but to shelter children fleeing bombs and persecution. Meanwhile, across Europe, their relatives were stripped of everything they had because of who they were. And long after the Nazi threat passed, people continued to spread lies about their supposed control over world events. To tell the dark story behind Waddesdon is to challenge those lies by revealing the human truths behind the marble and gold. It is to see the manor as a testament to resilience and generosity as much as to opulence. It is to remember that even the grandest houses are built by people with hearts that break, with hopes that are sometimes disappointed, and with the courage to turn wealth into acts of public good.